Thank you, Achal. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day two of the India Alternate Investment Conference hosted by the CFA Society India. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to wish everyone a very good morning. It's my immense pleasure to welcome our speaker on venture debt, Ankur. Ankur has had a wonderful career, about 15 odd years doing banking with bulge bracket banks like Citi, MS, JPM. And after that, he donned the entrepreneurial hat. He started Black Soil initially as an advisory firm where he worked with various mid-market companies and completed a dozen M&A deals. And then he morphed Black Soil into an asset management and a credit platform comprising of an NBFC and three AIFs, which have together got about 2,000 crores invested and currently have AUMs in excess of 800 crores. Over the same period, he has completed over 50 deals in the space, including some notable ones like Oyo Rooms, Uran, Setworks, and reasonably long list. My education, Ankur is a chartered accountant and CFA charter holder. I'd like to welcome him. He's got a very insightful presentation, which I'm very confident all of us will benefit from on Venture Day. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ankur.
Thanks, Pushkar, for the wonderful introduction. I would like to thank the CFA Institute for giving me this platform to really share some of my insights, which I've learned over the last 5, 6 years on this really emerging asset class called venture debt. And as we know, during this period of time, the startup space has become really very active. It has really got everybody's mind share right now. And we were sort of lucky to be at the right time and the right place to be able to start this interesting business on the venture debt side, and it is now seeing really hyper growth. As the entire ecosystem is growing, we are also seeing this is going to be an interesting phase for us and the ecosystem as such. And I believe this is an emerging asset class which everybody should really pay a lot of attention to, because even from investment perspective, even if you're advising to various HNI clients and you're working with family offices or even institutional clients, this is an interesting place to be in because of the multi-fold benefit that one can derive from it. So I would like to take this opportunity to take through my insights that I've learned about venture debt, how it works, what is the way one can sort of consider this, why is it interesting from an investor perspective, what is happening in it, how it is structured, and some of the works around it. So how will I go about it is first I'll try to sort of explain what we mean by private credit, right? Because that itself is also a very important space that India is sort of witnessing now, especially with the happening of IL&FS crisis and all. The emergence of various other pools of private credit are becoming important, and there is a lot of development happening on that front itself. So how venture debt fits into the entire space and how we sort of take it from there. So with that, I will sort of start the presentation, giving a little bit of global overview and then going into the more nitty-gritties about the concept. So overall in India, we believe this is like a $2 trillion debt market, of which the corporate bond part of it is around 20%, which is around $460 billion. If we break the corporate debt market itself, obviously you have banks, you have bonds, you have commercial papers, you have the foreign currency borrowing and other part of it, right? And within that, we have like between the bond part, we have almost, this is the breakup between AAA bonds, AA bonds, etc. So venture debt will be part of the other category, which is completely unrated, right? Because these are not investment grade papers that we're talking about. These are products which are obviously not companies which are not generally making profit, so they are not really understood by credit rating agencies. So in our category, this will not be unrated paper. They will be not investment grade as such. So they become very small percentage of the overall thing, right? Because we are talking about here, the current market of venture debt is around $400 million, and in the overall scheme of things, is extremely fractional. It's just like less than 0.5% of the market currently. But it is interesting to see is the kind of growth that we are seeing, right? Even the overall debt market is supposed to expand over a period of time. As we go, if we see at India level, that we are only at 55% versus how everywhere else it is multiple times more than that. So India itself, there's a good possibility of the debt market to grow, and within that, all other portions of it, including the bonds part, commercial paper, etc., is supposedly grow if we were to become a $5 trillion economy that we are all hoping it to become. But to even give you a little bit about the perspective on the various yields that our credit markets are sort of structured around. We have starting at 5-6% around a 10-year GSEC, and this can go all the way to 20% IRR yield when you go into a real estate debt. So there is a multiple kinds of lending that happen during this between this phase of time, and in the middle somewhere we have the structured and venture debt part of it, which is just below our RE debt in terms of the yields profile, but in terms of risk profile, we can understand this has gone way beyond the triple B minus product that people are understanding about. So this is definitely in the high yield space. There is no two doubts about it. And that's the reason that we will not see a lot of banks, NBFC really working on that aspect. So that's why you need very more specialized kind of lenders or credit or specialty lenders who sort of, or specialty finance guys who really understand this domain very well. It is not meant for every regular bank who does not understand this space to sort of get into it. So you need to sort of create that kind of understanding of the product to be able to start lending to this kind of asset class. And as we can see, there is a big gap in terms of spread if you see between a triple B minus as well as structured debt. In fixed income terms, anything between like 3 to 5% spread is significant, right? And also considering the fact that the way FDs have fallen, from HNI's perspective, this is an interesting asset class people are looking at, because this IRRs are almost akin to how you get monies in the equity market. So that's where sort of this is where the risk profile from the venture debt part of it sort of falls into it. This is an opportunity even for NBFCs to look at it, but as we know, NBFCs have their own issues that they're going through. The wholesale NBFCs had their own ALM mismatches recently, because of which wholesale has not been the talk of the town. It is now everybody wants to focus on RE, on more on the SME lending. So mid-market companies anyways are also not being able to raise money. So that's where this is an entire white space which is available to any potential specialty lender to focus on. So what are the kinds of private credit? When we speak private credit, what are the kinds of private credit? Some of these terms we'll be quite familiar with. One which is the most standard one is a direct lending, which happens by a lot of credit funds as well as NBFCs. The one which has recently been a lot in news has been the distressed debt because of NCLT. A lot of new foreign funds are coming, ARCs are coming and investing in bankrupt or about to be bankrupt NBFCs. This is also, it's very similar to what special situation funds do, which are sort of helping companies to do some kind of structured funding. For example, if you want to buy back shares of your private equity partner, if you want to sort of do kind of distribution of capital, which cannot be done using bank proceeds, if you want to do some kind of acquisition financing. So in those kind of situations, special situation comes in. And similarly on mezzanine debt, this is something like, for example, NBFCs can look at where you can take tier 2 funding in the form of CCDs, or they want to do some kind of OCD structures, or there is some kind of warrants attached to it, which is linked to some kind of equity upside that is going to happen. And the one which now I think which is required for the India development, which is on the find that where DFI is sort of focused on, is the infra debt, where we are seeing that we need long-term bonds, right? And that's where project financing has been a challenge as well for a lot of banks, because they are not being able to really king. So we need a very specialized infra debt players as well, where we're able to lend between 10 plus years kind of lending, depending on the project and the greenfield situation the project is in. And the last one is a real estate debt financing, where again, likes of Swami funds have come in and they have been sort of providing last mile financing to various projects. Again, a very specialized field, not meant for all NBFCs. It requires a lot of domain knowledge, understanding of the project, location, developer, etc. And that's where again, you need to have specialized lenders in this field as well. And there are a lot of now international players playing a very important role in it. There are domestic funds as well raising capital on it. But as you can see that all these places are required for the development of the private credit market. We can't just be depending on direct lending itself, right? Because the companies go through various phases of life, various corporates, various sectors have to go through various phases of life, and they need specialty lending portfolio guys to come across and sort of help them through that phase. and it provides a very interesting yield opportunities and return opportunities for those investors who can underwrite very thoroughly. And in the last and the least, for which we're talking about, is the venture debt aspect of it, which anyways we'll be discussing in more detail as we go forward. So what are the issues that we are seeing in terms of what are the factors that are causing for some of these specialized lenders to come in, right? Especially on the venture debt side. As you know, traditional banks are very fixated in terms of the way they can lend. They cannot lend towards IPs or intangible assets. We know startups focus on asset-light businesses. They don't really focus on creating assets. They are not in the business of investing in hard assets. And without hard assets, it's very difficult for a bank to lend. Right? There are some banks obviously who can lend to technology companies if you have a lot of EBITDA. But startups, as a nature, as we know, are generally loss making. So how for them to be able to wrap their their head around the fact that how do we look to a bank from a bank to raise funding for something like burn is very difficult for them to understand. So that is the first part, right? That they do not understand how the startup is really functioning, and also in terms of the business models that they are focused on. Some of these businesses are so new age. It does not fit in the traditional mindset, which is, they understand manufacturing, they understand trading, they may understand even infrastructure projects, but something what the startups are focused on, technology first businesses, digital first businesses, are not really very easy to understand. So they cannot, without having hard assets, without having personal guarantees from the promoter, without having pledge of shares, these are the kind of things makes it very difficult for a regular bank to really underwrite them. Then we come to sort of even suppose if it comes to a stage where the company may have profitability, but the time that it takes for a bank to even disburse to a startup is between 3 to 6 months. And as we all know, 3 to 6 months is like a lifetime for a startup. Between that period of time, the startup can really change its shape and form. And the capital requirements for a startup is like yesterday. They wanted the money yesterday. They don't want money like 3 months from now. So they need a lender who can understand what is the business, how it is functioning, where the money is going to go, how it is going to add value to it. And some of these key questions, some of the bankers may not be in a traditional banks, or even when I'm talking about banks here, we can also consider in the traditional NBFCs, the large NBFCs. So for us, we have to sort of consider that, the startup requirement is really wanting to work quite quickly, right? So they are in the market to disrupt. And without being able to work fast, it's very difficult for them to take care of their plans. So without that, sort of working with this entire banking and NBFC institution becomes a challenge. So after that, what happens is traditional banking products also may not work, right? So you need to really understand how these companies are structured, and you need to sort of create a product which works around the cash flows of the businesses and try to create something which is a bit more customized than the traditional products that are sort of already there in the business by the banks. So coming to venture debt as such, just giving a global overview, we have heard a lot of these players in internationally as well as in India. Some of these are very well-known names who have all taken debt from venture debt players. And as you can see on the left-hand side, this is extremely small representation, but there are multiple players in this space. SVB being one of the largest on that place, and in India also we have more than 5-7 players who are actively working on this space. But yeah, the size comparison we can't even sort of keep in mind. But obviously, Indian startup space has really took off only in the last 6-7 years. So we can't really compare the two things. But we know that at least it's picking up, right? On the equity side as well, if you see, we are expecting like 2020 was almost $130 billion was gone in this space versus $10 billion in India. But $10 billion itself, we know from our FDI perspective, it's a very large number. It is really helping us in multiple forms and helping creating jobs, creating businesses, which are really viable. And what we have seen is that generally venture debt is a certain percentage of the venture equity market. So in this case, it's like almost 15% globally. In India, it's just 4%, right? And even though it's expected to grow possibly at like 40% growth rate over the next couple of years, we'll be still like 5% of the overall VD market, of the overall VC market, right? So the VD market, which is the venture debt market, is still 5%. So there's a huge headroom. If you were to just consider the $600 million to become 15% of it, there is a large scale, large scope for the entire market to grow, right? So we are going to be following the global markets in terms of the percentage they follow. And there's a reason why we are doing a percentage of the VC market. The reason is very simple. That VD players come behind the venture equity players. So VD, they generally don't fund any startup. They only fund startups who have raised some kind of venture capital money, right? So some institutional money has to be there, not angel money. Once the institutional capital is there, then for a VD player, it is a company that can be considered possible for underwriting. And the reason is very simple, right? Because everybody can do a startup. Whether that startup is of a certain kind of pedigree, whether it is of a certain category, whether it can really scale. Some of these questions get answered when it is able to raise money from a venture capitalist. So automatically, the funnel gets really shortened or smaller once you have a venture capital player behind it. And that gives a lot of comfort as well from the perspective of a lender, because as you know, a startup is generally burning capital. And you cannot, if you're burning capital continuously, you need capital to raise continuously as well. So if you are just depending on angel investors, we all know angel investors have a limited kind of capital that they can sort of invest in a business. So from that perspective, it is important that you have a VC player who can generally pump money at various stages of life, right? So we have always heard in multiple cases, in any of our Indian startups as well, the existing guys will always be generally participating at least up to Series C, Series D level, right? So all 3-4 rounds of capital, they're coming and participating, which is very critical from a venture debt perspective, because venture debt is a concept. Now taking it ahead, venture debt is basically, it's an alternative capital, right? It is not substitution of venture equity. It is a capital which is complementary to venture equity, right? So how it happens, it's basically a merger of having a banking mindset because you're finally a lender, and a venture capital mindset because you're lending to startups. So you have to be somewhere in the middle, right? And that is something which is a very interesting domain to be in currently, right? Because not every venture capitalist can understand how the bank works, and not every banker can be a venture capitalist. So one has to really develop a very different kind of skill sets to be able to do venture debt. And from that perspective, what we have seen is there is a huge requirement for it, because as we just explained, that as the venture equity market is growing, the venture debt will follow it in the proportion, and itself there is a huge growth possibilities there. And from that perspective, why people sort of look at venture debt is it's basically a form of debt only. It's not very complicated. It's just a regular loan that is given without any real hard collateral and security, which is known in the traditional mindset. But we are sort of taking a certain kind of a warrant that gives you a lot of comfort. So why do people take venture debt, right? So there are these 4 broad reasons why people sort of try and take venture debt. One is that obviously if you take debt instead of equity, there is no dilution, that avoids dilution. Second is most important, I believe, is the runway extension, because startup sort of focuses always on their runway, right? How much money is in the bank, how much burn they have, divide by that, gives you the number of months they can sort of survive. And that is a number we have heard a lot of times. So like last year, when we had like COVID happening, we had these reports coming up that, so many X number of startups will die because their runway is short. But after that, we didn't really see that kind of news saying that, these many companies have actually died. There is a reason, because a lot of these guys were able to raise bridge rounds, they were able to raise venture debt, they were able to cut down their burn and extend their runway. So runway extension is like the most important meter, right? It's like their marathon they're running, and they have to continuously keep running. So it's a continuous marathon you're running, and you have to keep seeing the number of kilometers you're clocking, and you can only do it on the basis of the amount of fuel you have in your body. Third is increased valuation. So how does that happen? Basically, if your runway gets extended, and if you're a growing company, your multiple automatically you get an expansion on it, right? So if you are a company which was at X revenue, and then because of your taking debt, you are able to extend it and it becomes X plus Z, your multiple automatically expands, right? And you can raise the next round of funding at a much higher valuation. So keeping all that in mind, and the fact that it's a flexible structure compared to a banking structure, that sort of gives you a very interesting flavor from the perspective of venture equity investor as well, and from the perspective of a founder as well, right? So because all these benefits are not only for the perspective of a founder, but also from the perspective of venture equity, right? Because even those guys, once they are an early investor in the company, they also don't want to keep diluting at every stage. So these benefits of lesser dilution, extension of runway, higher valuation also is as important to a founder as it's important to even for a VC. So from that perspective, we have seen a huge interest in this product, and there's a reason why these things is working so far. So a little bit more in little detail about what I mean by venture debt, right? So this is a terminology which basically says that I will, as a venture debt provider, give a startup which is backed by VC a loan. This loan could be in form of a loan or an NCD, that is immaterial. But I will be just creating charge on all the assets of the company. Now, you might ask, what do you mean by assets of the company? You just said there are no hard collateral. But from a venture debt provider perspective, for me, assets are the IP of a company. I understand there's a huge value in the IP of a company. I understand there's a huge value in the brand of a company. I understand a huge value in the trademark of a company, which is something very difficult to value. But we know that if a company has raised, suppose 100 crores, and they have sort of used that money to create a certain brand, we know that it will have at least the value of my loan in the worst case scenario. So that really helps in sort of understanding the value of the IP. Apart from that, you may also have assets like receivables. You may have inventory. Like if you are a B2B player, you will have receivables inventory possible on your balance sheet. If you are a mobility company, you may have cars on your balance sheet. So you have some other assets on which you create charge on. And what does a startup do and the growth company do is that they will sort of keep repaying this money back in the form of regular EMI or EPI that we sort of do. So generally, venture debt providers stay away from bullet loan structures. This is a very simple 2-year, 3-year loans, which is sort of returned back in as EMI format. And the more interesting thing that why venture debt guys work on transaction is to get an equity upside through warrants. Warrants, as we know, is very simple. It's like a call option given to you. It's given at a valuation which is obviously hugely negotiated with the growth company. It is easier to get a warrant when the company is obviously in trouble. But that time, whether they want to give the company funding or not is different. But what is important is you want to work with a company which is really doing well and get a very interesting warrant, because the warrant generally have like a tenure of more than 6-7 years, and you're getting valuation, you're getting the warrant at the valuation of the current round, or a discount to the next round. So put together these two packages, being a only lender generally in the company, getting a regularly serviced your loan plus a warrant becomes a very interesting proposition from the perspective of a venture debt provider. And this use of venture debt can be for multiple uses, right? So we generally think of startup, and what comes to our mind is just e-commerce companies. But there are a host of kinds of startups which are out there who need different kinds of funding, and the venture debt can be structured in different forms. As I already mentioned, term loan NCD is one format. A revolving credit facility, which is akin to a bill discounting, is another structure. Revenue linked loans, which is basically a percentage of revenue you give us as payment instead of a regular EMI loan, is another structure. Post that, we also have a receivable discounting, which is little bit different from revolving credit facility, but it will basically bill to bill discounting, which is like, for example, you are a e-commerce player, or you are in terms of sort of you're servicing an e-commerce player and you're getting bills of an e-commerce player, then you can sort of discount it. For example, Amazon, Flipkart invoices are very well regarded in the banking community, can discount that as well. You are a company which is in an IoT space, and you're sort of having to really provide these assets on lease, then you can sort of use equipment financing. And the most last, which is very interesting, is also the contract financing, right? Because you have an order book, a lot of transactions you have there, you have to finance the orders. How do you sort of do that? So you can't keep using for all these kind of situations, which is, as you can see, a lot of it is working capital oriented. It's not great to sort of keep using any kind of just keep using equity for that. Coming to how is it different from venture debt and venture capital? So broadly, you may have sort of got an understanding. First is that venture debt guys generally a very small percent of the cap table. So that is they take a very extremely small percentage of the equity using the warrant, versus the venture capital who will generally take a large portion of the entire company. They obviously are equity oriented, so they are prone to fluctuation in the valuation. We, as venture debt guys, generally have an interest rate which is pre-agreed, so you do not really have any fluctuations really coming into it. And these are fixed rate contracts; these are not linked to any kind of floating rates. This is something that you have to repay over the period of time. It's clear. But we see sort of are generally longer in nature, right? So they can start exiting possibly from 4 to 7 years onwards, or maybe even larger. So you are there for a longer period of time to generate a larger multiple. Debt guys obviously are not multiple focused as such. They are more focused on getting IRR and getting the capital back faster. You need You need to have, obviously without valuation, it's not work on the venture capital side. They need a board seat. Venture debt guys are not sitting with a board seat. They're sitting passive investors. They're actively really focusing on the company as portfolio monitoring, but not as actively as a venture capital does. And they follow a very detailed diligence process, which is regular to how a private equity guy also does. But venture debt guys do not really go through that kind of rigor in terms of diligence. Their product structure is more similar to how venture cap company works. So overall, what we are seeing is that venture debt is basically an additional liquidity support that we can provide for various kinds of purposes. And it is obviously not at high cost as how it is for a venture capital guy, right? Because venture capital guys come for a 3x return, 5x return, but the venture debt guys return threshold will be around 1.3x, 1.5x only. So that's why it is an interesting way for somebody to look at it. And now, obviously, I've already sort of touched base some of these points, how we are different from our traditional debt, right? Because we are not focusing on profitable businesses. We are not taking hard assets or personal guarantees. We are much more flexible. We do not need a credit history. We're actually used to build a credit history because once the company gets profitable or EBITDA positive, our credit history can help to raise money from a bank. Traditional banks obviously don't take any kind of warrants. And generally the turnaround time for a venture debt guys is a couple of months, right, from the discussion stage. So it is a very high speed game. It doesn't work at the pace of how a traditional lender works. So I'll just quickly touch base on one case study to sort of give you a real example about how this kind of benefits can come from this structure, right? So if a company which is growing almost 6% per month and has a revenue of $3 million, were to sort of raise the next Series B, they will not take any kind of venture debt. The founder will be diluted from 67% to 46%, right? And the investor will be having another 33% to 54% if they were to raise a new round of capital. But if you were to sort of take venture debt in the middle, like after like few months, 6 months into the business, you take venture debt of $1 million, you can extend your Series B. Instead of November 22, you take in March 23. So 5-6 months you've delayed it, and you're able to increase your enterprise value from $26 million to a $32 million, right? And that's the reason sort of it makes a big difference, because your dilution, instead of which was for the founder at 46%, now you had only 51%. And you have to only give up like a 0.5% stake to the 0.8% stake to the venture debt guy, right? Because when the moment he came in, he helped to extend your runway and he was able to delay your fundraise. And because of that, your revenue, which was at one point of time possibly at like a $3 million, by the time you ended up taking this money, was now at $11 million. From 3 to 8 became 9, but now it became $11 million. So because of which your enterprise value is also increased. But what the venture debt guy was able to generate was an IRR up to 22%. Without warrants, it's at 18% IRR, and with warrants, it's almost 22% IRR, because he also getting a bump of a valuation. Because when he entered, the valuation of the company was only $4 million, or like, for example, $5 million, but now it has sort of really skyrocketed to $11 million. So he'll make 2x money in that as well. So by that point, by extending just by 4 months, he can help diluting the founder stake by almost 5%. So that's where sort of the entire concept really comes into it, the picture. And generally, venture debt guys can come at multiple stages, at Series A, B, C, right? So at all A, B, C stages, at all the stages people are coming in. Sometimes it is just to extend the runway, sometimes it to achieve a higher milestone, because the Series C guy wants a certain milestone that you have to achieve. And then after that, you can keep raising both kinds of capital. But if, as you see, it's not built before Series A. We are not generally coming when, you still do not have customer traction, or your prototype of the product is not really ready. So that's where sort of the entire business is sort of structured as, and that's where various situations where the money is being sort of utilized. So coming a bit about how the venture debt loan is structured, right? How do we sort of keep in mind multiple things? This is an extreme snapshot of it to give you an idea about it. The most important part of it is that, we generally, the VD loan is not like 100% of the equity raise. It's just a 20% total equity amount that has been raised by the company. So if you raise 100 crores of capital in your life, you are able to raise 20 crores as debt. Not that you are raising like 100 crores of debt as well on 100 crores of equity, which is very different from an SME lending situation. If you were to compare, companies which are like SME lenders are able to, suppose the net worth is 100 crores, they will be able to raise maybe 1:1 or 1:0.5 debt easily from banks. But in our case, the debt is only at 20% of the entire amount. What another interesting thing is that these guys are able to raise equity very easily, which we know that equity raising is not easy. But for them, if they want to raise debt, there are hardly few players in the market. So that's where sort of there is a very different situation, right? Because a lot of SME guys will be able to raise debt, but they won't be able to raise equity for their want of business models. Other important thing is the time risk, right? Because we are generally lending for 2 to 3 years itself and offer a moratorium of 3 to 6 months. So this is not a very long duration transaction that you're taking, right? So your average duration reduces significantly from the fact that your capital starts coming back from possibly in 3 to 6 months itself. And we are also sort of trying to create a little bit of a financial risk package where we sort of create covenants around the kind of burn that they can have, the kind of liquidity they have, the kind of business that they should perform, to try to even create some kind of structures around escrow so that you trap some kind of some type of cash flows from directly from the business, and even create a DSRA, which is basically a couple of months of EMIs are sort of kept as FD to us. So all those things sort of keep a good eye view on how the business is performing. And as I said, because you are the secured lender in the business, though not secured from the perspective of banking parlance, but from a perspective of a legal framework, you are a secured lender. You have charge on all the assets of the business, so you are sitting senior to all the equity guys, and you may get about 10 to 20% of the debt as equity upside. So this can sort of give you an interesting gain in the future. So some of the diligence checks that we look at before sort of being able to fund a company is that it's very similar to how a venture equity guy will look. Just the difference is that we will like to work in more situations where we can take a lesser amount of risk, like a venture capital guys can take, right? Because as our portfolio management, we want to have companies which all are able to really do well, unlike a venture capital guys who will have like some maybe 2 3 companies which can literally return the entire fund. But from our perspective, we have to build a portfolio where all the companies are able to perform well and not really have like too many sort of NPS. So the due diligence that way is similar, but the difference sort of comes into the last two parts of it, right? Where we are more focused on the unit economics, the runway, the working capital of the business, how they are being able to perform. If they're not able to raise the next round of funding, what will happen? And those kind of security checks, which I already mentioned about, including like you take a post-dated check, those kind of things which a regular lender does. Try to create an escrow so that you have more cash flow control on the business. So those things sort of keeps a certain kind of weight on the opposite side from a venture capital guys. But on the other side, how the market is doing, the competition is doing, how the management is, what kind of funding they have done, what is the kind of business model finally. So all these perspective things have to be considered into the mindset before being able to decide whether you want to fund any company or not. Just because you raise money from venture capital doesn't mean a venture guy will fund you, right? So you have to still go through the entire rigor. Coming to the market now in India, as you can see, it was extremely small in 2015, 2016. Now this has like really grown from maybe like less than $100 million. You have reached like $400 million, with doing more than 40-50 deals a year. And I think this will keep growing at the same pace of 25% CAGR. And as we can see the sectors, there are multiple sectors across who are sort of really focused on and raising money across various businesses, from e-commerce to fintech to edtech, health tech, enterprise tech, SaaS businesses. Everybody's been raising money. And just to add on to it, as we can see that there are multiple sectors, companies, business models who have been able to really go out and take money across sectors. A lot of these names you would have heard of, seen in the papers. Some of these are very SaaS kind of businesses you may not have seen. But the interesting thing is that venture debt is sort of required for everybody. It's not really a very, very specific game meant for only like a couple of players in the business. So that's where there's a huge uptake for it. So I'll just take a pause, and if I have a couple of questions to take right now, Pushkar would be happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Ankur. We have a very active audience. They've asked a few questions. I'll try and merge a couple of questions that we have on regulations to start with. One question that came up was that European regulations have restricted participation from various banks in favor of VDs. That's created space for venture debt industry to grow in Europe and some of the Western markets. How do you see the Indian regulations currently and evolve from here in terms of helping VD grow from where it is?
So it's an interesting one. Right now, I don't think VD is in the top of the mind for any of the regulator, to be honest. So how the VD work right now is more from the perspective of this being regulated like a regular lender. So if you're an NBFC, you're following RBI guidelines, and if you're structured as an AIF, so you're following SEBI guidelines. So it is as sort of simple as that. There is not really significant difference in terms of any other regulation. So you're lending, so you have to follow the RBI guidelines regularly. And if you're a credit fund structured as an AIF Cat 2, you follow under the SEBI guidelines, and you have to do the works around that.
One related question on regulations is what reprieve does law offer venture debt in case of startup bankruptcy? You follow the same process as normal companies going through NCLT?
Yeah, it is the same process. So if you're a lender, if you have SARFAESI, you can go through that entire process of recovery from SARFAESI, or you can go through the regular NCLT works. But just to like complete the question, it doesn't work like that because what happens in these kind of companies is, unlike a promoter run company, and that's where this is interesting, is that these are all run by professionals. So when you're working with these guys, they do not want the company to reach that stage, and then the lender starts figuring out a way to find out it. If there's a problem in a company, you realize like 3-6 months before the problem is supposed to happen, and then you work very closely to find a solution, whether that is M&A, strategic sale, like whatever way that you can sort of salvage the company, instead of going completely into NCLT. Because by that time, because it's an IPO run business, your team would have left only technology. There may not be enough buyers for the market. So practically, if you'll see, you'll not hear many NCLT cases for startups. There will be many M&A cases for startups. You'll hear a lot of down rounds happening. You'll read about VCs taking a lot of cuts on their valuation, etc. You will see founders leaving and all, but not really NCLT.
One more question from audience is around the NPAs or percentage of failures. Let me sort of expand on that question. What overall, what is the percentage of failure on NPA, and which sectors, as an industry, do you see to be more vulnerable than the others?
So actually, because this is still a very evolving space, there is no real industry NPA to say such, because the perspective is that this is still a credit which is being built, right? So like for us also, it's been just 4.5 years that we've been building onto this. But the acceptable level of credit risk would be around 2 to 3%, not beyond that. That is what we can we can estimate. And what happens is that a lot of these companies, if the only way that you really lose money is when the company really shuts down, and that is the stage when you really take a credit risk. Otherwise, what, as I just mentioned earlier, we have seen like enough situations where the company may become NPA because you're not serviced for the last 90 days, but there will finally be an M&A situation or strategic sale happening, and you'll be able to recover your loan. So most situations I've seen the venture debt guys to be able to really recover their principal. Maybe you take a loss on the interest, but generally it's not the case. And sector wise, again, it's not driven by one specific sector that one sector does well or some sectors are bad. So it's about following whether one sector is overfunded or not. So if you take 2015 as an example, there were too many e-commerce companies getting funded. So if you are funding each and every e-commerce player, then you become there'll be an issue for you, because finally only few players will be left. So if you are funding the fifth, seventh, eighth player, and the game is in the first three players in the market, then you'll sort of really have a charger. So you have to build a portfolio extremely carefully. So the sectors that we are seeing on the screen right now, so you have to build a very diversified portfolio. So that's what sort of everybody in the venture debt market is doing, not just Black Soil, so that you have a very, very, very smaller and different kind of portfolio, which is not sort of focused on one specific sector itself.
All right. One follow-up question just came up on NPA. Can you share any experience with an NPA? How do you work through a situation like this? How do you improve the outcomes for your fund?
Correct. So there have been, like, obviously, see, we have done 50 transactions. We cannot say there will not be any NPA situation. So we've had like some of them. But what happens is in a lot of cases is, as I mentioned, you have to support the company. You don't work like a bank. You don't go out and sort of shut the business day after tomorrow. You don't start saying, give me the cash flow, whatever you're collecting to me. What you have to ensure is that the bank business continues, and the company is obviously focused on some kind of solution. So if there is a solution around it, then you have to support it. And you have to be actively speaking to the company and to the investors and to see where the business is happening.
So we have seen like NPS happen in fintech and SaaS businesses, and even e-commerce businesses happen. But finally, they were either merging with a company which was similar space, so that more equity investors came into the place, and they took out the management, they took out the competition, and they sort of became a bigger player and a stronger player out of it. So that's generally the outcome, right? Because VC investors are very practical and they are able to take a call very quickly. And even the professional management that I'm sort of talking about, the founders, if they are very, very open to feedback. So there have been multiple situations where the venture debt guys will provide them feedback. Your burn is very high, your productivity is low in these certain segments. And because we are also sitting in the market, seeing multiple kinds of business models, we can also give a lot of feedback about how things should function. And that is the time we have to sort of go with them. So like currently we also have one current company which is sort of going through a trouble, and there are two venture debt guys who are sort of supporting the company through this space, and they are taking care of vendor payments, they're taking care of some other critical payments, ensuring the company is running to a certain level. But because we can see there is a possible outcome there, so at that time you cannot come and shut down the business, right? Because that will not help. You have to ensure there is certain equity value left in the company, then you will be able to recover your debt.
So that's the big difference between venture debt and banks. Venture debt are not interested in closure; they're actually interested in uh, making business continue as is, or even growing it, so that there's new equity which can come in to fund the operations. On a related issue, could you talk a little bit about some of the typical covenants that you guys put in to protect yourself? How do you think about think issues like companies taking up excess debt, or companies continuing on the path that the business plan told you that they would?
Totally. So that I think is it's like it depends to each venture debt strategy. So Blackstone asset is very covenant heavy. Some of the other players may not be that heavy on the covenant. So they believe in more freedom given to the companies. So what we believe is to create some kind of a business border that we know that the company is functioning a certain kind of perspective. So the covenants can be around the amount of debt to equity the company has, the kind of burn they do, the kind of business plan they have to attain, the kind of margins they need to have, the kind of liquidity they need to maintain, the kind of further debt that they can take. So some of these specific covenants is something that we build upon. But finally, what happens is there will be situations in a 2 to 3 year period that they will really breach the covenants. So that is not the time that you decide to call an event of default and call back your loan. That's not how the business works. How it works is that as long as the company is doing things which are right, in the right direction, the business, some things are out of your control, so you have to go and help the company at that time. You cannot just be calling event of defaults and sort of quite getting your capital back, because you can do it maybe for one company, you won't be able to do it for all, and then you will not be seen somebody who's an enabler of the ecosystem, but somebody who can really ensure that the business continues, as you just mentioned. So it is all transaction to transaction that one has to take a call. There is no one set piece that one has to look at it, but there are multiple ways that one can that way control. As I mentioned earlier, that you can have even an escrow where you can take certain cash flows of the business directly under your control, which can be like maybe 2 times the EMI that you're doing. So that gives you a certain more leeway and control what the company is going through. And there are a lot of information obligations that you have. So it's very important. Unlike traditional lenders, at any point of time, all VD guys will know what's happening in their portfolio, and it's very critical to keep tracking them. And if there is something which is going amiss, so you can always call and speak to the equity guys, or you can speak to the founders, and you will get a lot of easy access to it.
Got it. Couple of interesting questions around revolving credit structures. Audience wants to know if they are possible. Do you see something like a cash credit facility come up in the industry as a possible solution
So
for
that
the
yeah,
startup needs?
yeah. So we are already doing that. So it's something we've already been working on for the last 1 year, because we have also an NBFC in place. So this is something that we have also structured around. And I believe it's actually the need of the hour, because a lot of these SaaS businesses have enterprise customer. The logistic businesses have enterprise customers, so they need these kind of solutions. It will not be as efficient as the banking line, because NBFCs and funds is not really having those kind of working capital facilities given to them. But it is something that we have structured, where we are taking certain collections of the company and creating a line around it, which they can draw down for a small period of time and pay it back for the time used, and then again draw it back based on the kind of billing they are doing. So it's like a drawdown formula that we have created based on certain parameters on collections and billing, on which they can sort of keep drawing on, and there's a lot of interest for it. So the question is completely correct, and there are a lot of people focused on it, because they don't want to keep funding on the perspective of EMI on term loan basis, because term loan has to be returned. At least revolving credit facility can be sort of continuously done. And a lot of banks also now want to do that, but the problem of banks is that they want to take almost like 80% of it as FD, or 90% of it is FD. So it's really not solving their problem. But a lot of startups end up doing it because of the perspective that we'll end up building some credit history with them. But banks really enjoy a lot of CASA in that aspect.
Got it. Another interesting question from the audience is, this person would like to understand your process a little better than asking you a very direct question, saying, would you lend to a company like Cred, which has no revenues, or a similar company? I mean, that's an example. Company with no revenues, but almost certain of raising capital simply because of maybe pedigree of the entrepreneur, it's a serial entrepreneur, or just the quality of investors who have come in the first round.
So as a venture debt player, I can say in this segment, definitely there are players who will do it. Whether Blackstone does it is a very different question. So whether I have done it in the past, I can say very emphatically that we have not done it in the past. So whether we do it in the future, maybe whatever points have been mentioned, it gives clarity that there is a reason why would you fund it is on the basis that further equity happens. But we have seen time and again that it's very easy for some of the startups, not specifically talking about Cred, but generally startups, a lot of startups who become unicorns, and they've quickly sort of just become like maybe just 100 crore company in the few years. So as lenders, that's why I mentioned that we are not really focused on getting those. You can get those big names from your marketing perspective when you're raising your fund. But finally, you need companies who are like, more keeping their head down, working on the businesses, ensuring there is cash flows, and are able to obviously generate possibly next round of funding.
Got it. I'd like to ask one more question, and then we can carry on with the presentation, take some more questions at the end. How do you see the domestic capital pools and family offices responding to your fundraising efforts? What are the typical types of investors that you guys go and talk to when you do fundraising?
Correct. So I think the next section is about that itself. So we can definitely more than happy to answer this, because I think Indian domestic capital really needs to start going to alternative as a space itself, right? Not just saying about venture debt. And because Blackstone itself has been found by 3 family offices, so I can very closely say that this is an asset class which is really well nourished in terms of capital that is required. And there's a huge requirement for it, and we believe that the domestic capital guys have to start taking more active interest in alternatives itself, right? We know that it is only very large families who have like large corpus who are really banked by the top private banks are really funding alternatives. But when it comes to the mid-tier HNIs and all, they are not really focused on alternatives. And a lot of people think there is no real businesses that these guys are doing. It's a lot of frenzy, there's a lot of capital chasing, there's just valuation games. But somebody has to spend a little time and they'll see that, there is actually businesses happening. And I think COVID was the right test for the startup ecosystem as such, right? Because if there was going to be something which could kill the startup ecosystem, I think could have been COVID. There was no other doubt of it, because if lockdown could not kill your business models, there's nothing could have like sort of done anything else. And these companies have all emerged stronger. So from that perspective, the perspective that these companies are raising capital without anything underlying, that something needs to be understood better. And I think fund managers like us have to do better explaining to these possible HNIs that how and why these companies are really important to fund, and they can give a good return as well, right? Whether next round of funding happens or not, or how it happens. So I definitely think this is something is of high interest now. Definitely, like we ourselves were able to raise a fund in the pandemic, sitting at home from a lot of the HNIs investors itself and family offices, and we are continuously flooded with this kind of queries around this business, and many of my other peers in the sector have also raised a lot of money from family offices. So this will remain an important segment to raise funding from, because for us to raise institutional money is going to take time. So that's how I see it happening.
Wonderful. I think let's complete the presentation for now, and then we'll take some more questions at the end.
Sure. So as I was speaking about why should an HNI or a family office sort of look at investing? Because there are two components from venture debt perspective, right? So you have an interest component where you can look at a 15% coupon you're being paid on a regular basis, and in EMI basis you can earn almost per month 6 lakh rupees on a 10 crore loan, and you get an IRR of 16%, plus a warrant which can give you additional IRR of almost 3%. So, and if you get an XIRR of almost 19%, based on the fact that even if there is no warrant valuation happening, even the debt part of it can give you a good, extreme, interesting, fixed, high income return, right? And why I say this is sort of different from venture equities on one more perspective, right? Because if a company, because a lot of questions came on the what happens on NPA. But when a company goes through an NPA, like for example, 3 years into a loan, you're like, if you've already got 50% of your loan back, and a company becomes an NPA, at least you would have recovered almost 50% or like possibly 40% of your loan amount, right? You're just sitting on 6 crores of your debt, but possibly almost 50 to 100, 50 to 75 crores of equity money that is gone to the companies that completely at risk. So your debt to equity sort of really helps you in terms of the risk being completely on the perspective of the equity guys to ensure they get an exit. And that's where sort of your amount is very small, and the interest that has come from the equity guys so high that they have to ensure that you find an exit, and automatically even you are aligned with them. So even if there is an NPA, your complete write-off is there. The equity guys are going to take 60 crore worth of write-off, 50 crore worth of write-off, and you are going to be taking possibly just 5 crore worth of write-off. And you would have earned some interest income in this period of time, and your cash loss will be possibly even less than that. But if a company does really well, and you get an additional 3% IRR, this can even take care of in our portfolio manager, even consider this as something that can be hedged against a potential NPA. So at a portfolio level, you can get maybe 5 companies which are giving you good extreme, this better IRR, which can be hedged against a company which is going through an NPA. So at portfolio to portfolio level, that's why I said 2 to 3% NPA is like where the highest level that one can should expect if you build a very good quality portfolio. So how does we look at it from portfolio allocation perspective? How do you see venture debt sort of fit into it? Sort of, I'll take the point in the middle first. I think what happens in the venture debt portfolio, like if you see some of the logos behind in terms of sectors, from Blackstone or any other fund perspective, we end up working with like some 30 funds in the country, and we are picking up like almost like 3 to 4 portfolio companies from each over a period of like 4 to 5 years. So our venture debt investor will get sort of an exposure to across all the fund managers in the country, across sectors. You can't get a more diversified set, right? Instead of taking a call on XYZ fund, you're taking call on a XYZ venture debt player who has exposure to multiple funds. So it's a more diversification across sectors, right? And across fund managers. So this is very interesting, right? Especially there are a lot of investors who have not taken any VC exposure. This is the right way to take an exposure to the startup world, because you are getting a fixed income return plus a potential upside coming to it, right? And we are taking a horizon where you're able to repay the loan. It's not like a venture capital fund where your money is going to come at the completely fag end of the fund. You're getting money from day one. Your money is being distributed for the first month itself in terms of interest, and in 2 to 3 years you start getting your principal back as well. So there's a lot of visibility about when you go into venture debt fund versus going to the equity fund. Coming to the perspective, if you look at from the perspective of how it is correlated to a traditional fixed income product, it's not at all, because as you can see, we were at the fag end of the yield curve. We are not sitting at the, we are not linked to the G-Secs. We are not linked to the kind of what is happening in the credit market as such. It's not like, tomorrow 50 basis points, the yields have increased and the venture debt portfolio is going to change, because this is all fixed income in nature. We are sort of know the fixed rates
And this is how you're sort of structuring it. It is more driven by competition, the pricing, than it is driven by what is happening in the credit market as such currently in the country. So this is completely complementary to your fixed income portfolio. It is sitting with your equity portfolio also to some extent because the returns are so high, and it's sitting with your but it's structured as a fixed income product. And because of the fact that it's a high yield in nature, you and the current downward trend in the interest rates, we can see this is a very good alternate space to be in, and you can definitely leverage this as an additional asset class which can give you improving kind of returns than what it is currently given, right? So from an overall perspective, what we see, it gives you a very interesting risk adjusted returns without taking the risk of a venture equity. You're able to protect your principal at least. And the last structure, that how sort of we are structured is, so this is, I'm giving you an example. If you're structured as a fund, you will be investing through an Cat 2 fund, will be investing in unlisted companies through various portfolio entities, and you will be regular AMC where an IC is controlling it and the works around it. So basically a lot of HNIs and even foreign capital can come directly into this fund, and sort of and you can keep doing distributions as and when the distribution happens from this portfolio company minus the expenses goes back to your investors, whether it is domestic or foreign capital. So that's how a Cat 2 is structured. If you're structured as an NBFC, then it is how a general NBFC works. So your entire asset portfolio is built around lending to various companies, and they can be structured as NCDs and loans. Okay, but these will all be structured as NCDs, obviously, because as a fund you cannot be giving loans directly, right? So that's not allowed under SEBI guidelines. So from here, sort of I'll hand it again to Pushkar. So happy to take further questions. I think this seems to be an interesting topic. I've been able to evoke some interest in this asset class, so I would love to answer for more questions if we have time.
Thank you, Ankur. We have questions that are flying in. Please keep posting your questions. Your questions make the conversation even more interesting. So I'll kick off with a few of the ones that we have accumulated so far, and I'll try and bunch them up in context. So how do you prevent, first question is, how do you prevent companies from getting excessively leveraged? You mentioned that you're probably comfortable with debt being about 20% of the equity raised. What if these companies go and raise leverage subsequently with other NBFCs or other banks? How do you prevent that? How do you put in collateral? Do you put in certain covenants, or do you monitor them? How does it work?
So first is that once you're inside the company, as I said, we are a secured lender. So we have taken a charge on all the assets of the company, right? So it's a charge filed with ROC. So you cannot really do anything without taking our approval. What happens is the covenants may allow you to take further leverage, but finally we have to cede charge in the favor of the other lender. So, and I'm sure no lender would like to not take pari passu charge, because this is not a structure where you work on second charge or you work on unsecured lending. But as a concept, what I would like to explain is startups don't work like a traditional company. And that's where there's another differentiation. If somebody goes out and takes another round of debt after my debt itself, I'll be very happy, because this is a capital game. And this is something I can sort of say that my first unicorn that we ended up funding, Ritesh, he explained to us, I am in the capital game. You give me equity or debt, for me both are important. So it is not to be seen from the perspective of the fact that this is, I cannot take further leverage, because it is a risk sharing business. So we have to share the risk in debt also, you have to share the risk in equity also. And the more lenders come into the picture, that gives you like that much confidence that your underwriting is strong, right? That's the only reason you'll be able to attract further lenders. And companies' growth cannot be stalled because you cannot take further risk, as long as it is acceptable level of risk. So that is, what is the acceptable level of risk goes from business to business. So there are companies at the beginning where we funded, they would have raised only 50 crores of equity, and I would have given, for example, 10 crores of debt. Now those guys have gone up and raised 500 crores of equity, and now they are able to raise another 500 crores of debt, but they are able to raise debt at 10%. So I'm sitting very happy technically, right? So you may say, okay, boss, you were at 10 crores, now you've become like so much more debt has come. And I'm not giving you a random number. This is actually the case from one of my portfolio companies. And you will think that this is not like possible, but I'm saying that you cannot stop the growth of a company as well, right? Because the more debt is companies, you're just extending the runway that much more. And if extending the runway, it possibly isn't going beyond the loan tenure. So as long as the business model is not going haywire, right? Suddenly you, from a revenue generating business, do not become a cash guzzling business.
as long as some of those things are in place, you're fine, right? So, but I have seen generally 9 out of 10 startups, nobody is stupid, because they are also creating a business. And now the kind of founders that we generally end up working are very smart guys, right? These are all guys with 10, 15, 20 years of experience, not really college dropouts who are just coming and, burning money. So that world is not generally there right now. There will be some guys out there. There will be some of those guys, but generally it is not the case.
One question that came up from audience was, can you talk a little bit about success rate of venture debt globally? What kind of MOCs, IRRs that they typically generate, and how does it compare with early data in India?
So I think I know that in US the IRRs generally range between 10 to 15%. That is what their focus area is. And in terms of MOIC, I actually don't have the data on hand, so I don't want to give a number which may be incorrect. But I don't think it will be beyond the same 1.3 to 1.5%. This will be the range that we'll be working at. Because this is not a private equity space where you'll be getting a huge multiple, right? Because your loan, which is reducing balance method, and it's not a bullet loan as well, and it is not linked to some kind of valuation of the company. So it will be generally a lower MOIC. So that's why in most of the funds we have a distribution, we have a redistribution capital clause that we can reinvest the principal during the first 3 years or 5 years of your loan during a commitment period, so that you can improve the MOIC.
Got it. If you look at it from a VC perspective, you may say MOIC is not that attractive, but if you look at it from a bank's perspective, it's a very lucrative space. So somebody wants to know, why are banks not participating in this very attractive space in India?
So as I said, they have their own problems right now to focus on. There are, we all know that the amount of problems that is there, it's like humongous. And as I mentioned, retail SME is the flavor for everybody. And they just want to keep growing that book, whether you get a personal loan book or whether the SME book. Venture debt requires a very different mindset, and you need a very different kind of skill sets. It needs a lot of mind share. It needs to really overhaul your risk underwriting strategies, your credit team, everything. It doesn't just fit into your regular bucket. So from the return threshold, whether a bank should do it, obviously it makes sense, right? But it's very difficult. It's like saying microfinance is also extremely high returns. Why is the bank not doing it, right? Because it's the same thing. You need to have a very different culture and a company structure to build it. There are a lot of NBFCs who are doing very well in equipment financing. Why aren't you doing that? So what they are doing, they can do better is fund NBFCs who are doing that well, than to do maybe a co-lending structure with them, than to sort of go out there and build out their own teams. There have been banks who are trying it. It's not, I'm not saying. We keep interaction with multiple banks who want to do that. But what has happened is what they want to do. I just had a call yesterday only, just for to give you an example. They want to fund companies which have raised like 500 crores of equity. I will give them money against FD. I'm still like, okay, fine. So that is the level of risk that they are at. So this far away. So, and just to be honest, if they come into the business and they start doing the work that we are doing, then I'll be out of business. So that is also the case.
Good. An interesting question is about use cases for, typical use cases in India. We've seen a lot of use cases for overseas markets, Western markets. But are there any India-specific use cases that you see the venture debt industry catering to?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, our first transaction was an Indian use case. I'll sort of give you an example. This was a company which got disrupted overnight through a telecom directive that had come, which suddenly shut down their business overnight. And they sort of needed money for like period of two to 3 months to ensure, they'll be able to overhaul the discussion on the directive. So it was a sort of an issue which was between DOT and TRAI and all those things. Suddenly the business went dry overnight. So this is something like India specific kind of example. Like when suddenly you need some kind of bridge funding during a period of time to ensure that, a regulatory issue is solved. That is one. Another regulatory issue I can give you is we funded an NBFC when they were going for a capital raise, and you would be aware of this. When you go for that capital raise, you need to go for RBI approval because of change in control for more than 20-25%. So they need money to ensure that they keep growing business during that period of time. So it's another kind of bridge funding. So if you see, a bridge funding in India is something again where a venture debt player can play a key role to ensure that a certain kind of bridge period is sort of completed. Another one very active in India is, a term sheet funding is what they call that. You have got a term sheet and you want to ensure, by the time the capital hits for 2 to 3 months, the business sort of goes on. And I can see from your smile, you understand from your business as well how these things sort of work in, and there won't be any bank who will sort of really come and understand
NPS
it.
charged.
Yes, but it's required, right? It's the business need. And there are sort of lot of these situations. Like it's very another interesting one just came up this week, where somebody wanted not to pay stamp duty. They want to change the registered office, and they want to ensure the business runs during that period of time. And they've done all the SHA, SPAs in the picture, right? So there are a lot of these practical cases, which I would say can come into the picture on the bridge funding side. Similarly, like if you're working in India, your enterprise receivable cycle is so large, and you're growing month on month, you cannot keep using equity money for that funding or working capital. So that's where again it makes sense to use something like venture debt or revolving credit facility to finance that. Then you have contracts. We just funded a company called Idea Forge, which was in the news. It has now very like a Indian Army contract which has come in, but no financing is available to them for that. So how do you do that? So that's where sort of something like our kind of venture debt funding can help them, grow. And they're taking debt from multiple other players as well for that. So a lot of these situations are there. Each business goes through its own cycle, and they need sort of kind of debt funding, which sort of will take care of their, immediate business growth requirement.
Questions on from an LP's perspective. What sort of LPs have been easier to raise money with? Which are the type of LPs you are still building relationships with? How do you see the fee structure for typical? What is the typical fee structure for a VC fund? What kind of returns can LPs expect over time by investing? It's a shorter vehicle compared to a classic VC fund. From a turnaround, your deals are 2 to 3 years in tenure versus a private deal, which is typically 5 years, 6 years, 7 years sometimes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so on a lighter note, I can just share my fund presentation to sort of explain all these points. So from generally we are looking at an IRR of 18 to 20% at the gross level. For a typical fund, for a 300 crore fund, you will at least end up doing at least 30 to 40 companies. So it's a very diversified pool of companies across sectors. The kind of LPs who are very comfortable with, who are guys who will want fixed income returns, right? So everybody I know in India, you take a regular Gujarati family or a Marwadi family, everybody likes monthly some income coming into their picture, right? And this is secured in some structure, in some format, right? So which used to be the case in the unsecured market almost 5 years ago, which is sort of, I would say, this is what we are trying to create a product around that this is a portfolio of companies. You have a manager who's focusing on the company, and you'll be able to get the capital on a regular basis, and they're ensuring that that they at least know what is happening in the company. It's not that you're just given the money like a bank, and when the NPA happens, and then you start figuring out what happened, what went wrong, and then you're calling people and getting the hang of it. So from that perspective, a lot of traditional families are getting comfortable with this asset class. How it happens is, what we have seen typically is some of them start doing co-investments first with us, because we are an NBFC. We have also provided those co-investment opportunities, downselling some of our portfolio to them, and they can pick and choose 3 or 4 companies that they like, or 3 or 4 sectors they like. They get comfortable with the fund manager, and they're like, okay, boss, I can't keep doing this every month. I might as well invest in your blind pool. And if there are any interesting co-investment opportunities, let me know. So it's a trust building exercise. It takes time. It's not like you can do it over like 1 meeting or 2 meetings, but everybody, there are a lot of sophisticated investors who've been doing venture debt through their own family offices, like their own startups. They have invested, they have given venture debt to them. And then there are obviously there are guys who've been doing, they won't create as a portfolio, right? This has to be a big part of it. And there are very few credit funds that they can invest in. Especially like if you go to larger credit funds, the minimum ticket size for investment is like 10 crores. So that may not fit for every HNI and family office to take that kind of exposure to begin with. So from that aspect, it's a very large possible HNI base that one can tap into and talk to. And we are seeing that the various benefits are enough to sort of entice them to at least have a very detailed conversations, whether they invest now or whether they invest 1 year from now. I'm sure that if you show performance of your portfolio, it is very exciting for them to really, you can't ignore it. You can't ignore in the hand of the investor 14-15% IRR in today's markets for sure.
So you're saying 18 to 20 gross IRR and a net of fees about 14-15% IRR in the hands of the investor.
Correct.
And for a relatively secure product, because you're sitting more senior in the cap table, you have call on the assets. One more interesting related question is, a lot of your assets are intangible assets, right? The brand, ability to fund. So, for a classic bank, there are probably more collaterals available. How do you sort of think about this in context of your investments? How do you think about collaterals in your context?
Correct. So I think I missed out on this very important point, saying we are cash flow lenders. We are not collateral lenders. For us, how much you collect on a monthly basis and how do you collect and what are the quality of your receivables or your revenue is more important than your collateral. Because as a lender, we are not in the business of going and selling assets. I sort of quite emphatically say that because, as a bank, if you could sell assets, we do not have the NPA problem, right? So you should be able to sell your power plants, your land, your machinery, plant machinery, everything. So you can be very happy with those assets. But in India, we are not as liquid as US. That in US, I heard that you can sell anything under the sun for a value. But that's not the case for India. So even if you have an NCLT process, does not mean that you get the money. That just means there's a process to be able to sell and get all the committee of creditors on one table. So you don't want to be in a business which you are happy that you have an asset which has no value ultimately when you have to go and sell. So you want to have, even though IP you cannot value, but the question is whether you can at least transact at your loan outstanding value. So if it goes below that, that means the company really did not have underlying IP. So that's how sort of I look at it. Whether the last question I have to answer in my committee call or in my own mind is whether the company will shut down and whether I'll be able to recover my loan value or not.
So a bunch of questions on distressed funding. So I guess from your perspective, given that you do cash flow lending, distress would be really a special situation where you see strong cash flows. Maybe the distress is at the shareholder level rather than at the cash flow level. That's how you would approach it, or?
So we obviously don't look distress because distress requires a very different framework and thought process and a team, right? Because a lot of distressed lenders, I think there could be two types, broadly speaking. One would be the guys who just take the asset and sell it, right? You just split the assets of the company and sell it. Other is like the company is still doing fine, just improve the management, change the management, I can do it. Or third could be possibly the shareholder level issues only. None of these cases, the venture debt certainly comes into the picture. So generally, for distressed transactions, our venture debt is a more performing credit space. It's not really a distress kind of space that currently the players are focused on because they're in a performing credit to focus on. Why would you go out and work for distress? People obviously distressed customers do come to you, but you should be able to evaluate whether this guy is in distress or not, and whether you should take an exposure on them or sort of pass it on.
Got it. Let me remind the audience that the presentation will be available in the briefcase on the homepage. Just in case you missed any slides, you can always go back and take a look at it and download it. Meanwhile, we carry on with some of our questions. There are a bunch of questions around COVID, very topical. What kind of DD changes have you done given the COVID, both in terms of at the company level as well as in terms of how you execute it? There's a whole problem of traveling to various places, factory premises for your own team and staff or your DD partners. Also, the kind of cash flow challenges that the business might be facing. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So COVID was obviously for all of us, as we know, it's too cliche to say unprecedented events and something black swan event and all of that. But yeah, so we were able to really do our diligence and portfolio control and all because we are working with startups who are all digital first. These are not businesses you need to be in their warehouse to know what is happening in the company. The best part, as I said, working with professional managements is that you get enough information at any point of time. I can easily say that for any of the guys who work in startup ecosystem, getting access to founders at any point of time is just generally a WhatsApp message away. So that's what we had to first focus on, is to ensure what is happening with the portfolio and to know which one is under trouble. And there were like 2-3 types of companies, right? One company which was actually doing very well, like suddenly in the month of May they are doing better than what they were doing in the month of March. So these are like companies which are in the last mile logistics space, right? Suddenly their business, they were getting more. So you like tell them, okay, boss, you want more funding, I'll give you another line of credit. That's how we saw one kind of companies. Second line of companies, they were doing bridge funding, and they would need maybe a small top up on the debt side. So now we know what COVID meant. So you could easily take a call whether this is a business which is impacted by social distancing or not, right? Or and the entire lockdown scenario. So if they are not, they are in the enterprise space, there are SaaS businesses, there are possibly health tech businesses. So you are more than happy to provide them a helping hand. Third are businesses which are definitely under trouble. And fortunately for us, I'm not saying that we were some really smart as people. We were able to not have too much exposure to retail and hospitality kind of businesses or travel businesses. So we were able to sort of really save ourselves from that aspect, because there are businesses who were doing, for example, EBITDA positive businesses, and suddenly you have COVID and all your centers are now, or all your businesses are obviously shut down. So in all that situations, if the company, we know underlying strength is there, they were able to raise bridge funding from existing backers. And a lot of the cases, what happened was, by the time of March, a lot of funding was also in place for many companies. So if you ask a lot of the VC guys, almost 50-60% of the portfolio was having 6 to 9 months of runway already. So it was a matter of just seeing through that period of time, and knowing how they are functioning. So, and I think thankfully RBI also came up with this moratorium guidelines, which was very timely, and we also had to provide to quite a decent percentage of a portfolio the first moratorium, then half of that percentage for the next second moratorium, and then from 1st September onwards, literally business as usual had started happening. We're already seeing from July, August onwards, businesses coming 70-80% level to pre-COVID levels. And sort of now going back to post-COVID levels. So obviously, there were like sectors in mobility space which guys are still struggling with, and there will be a different kind of situation, which is like complete fallout from a situation of COVID. But majority companies being digital first were able to grow than not grow. And from September onwards, we also got a bit more comfortable with the situation. We also started growing. And I could also say like our last quarter in Q4 FY21 was 2x of our last year. So that is the kind of growth we are seeing in the business. And it has nothing to do with the fact that huge amount of funding is coming. That's why, venture guys are also going all over the place. But there's underlying growth in these businesses. That's the reason sort of we are also were able getting very comfortable. Now COVID is back. We know the drill. So it's not that we are really worried about what is going to happen, everybody knows what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do. And some of the benefits of COVID, knowing is that you have to be careful, right? Finally, when you're lending now, you have to be careful that why you're lending to a sector, right? Because we know it's not gone away. So if you're taking an exposure to a retail space, you have to be knowing why you knowingly have to take a space, that exposure, or a travel space. So you are all focused on sectors which we know, COVID or no COVID, they'll keep doing well. That's sort of, at least at a top level of your mind, you want to sort of keep that in mind.
So look at the long-term business prospects, look at the cash position currently, look at where these businesses are going over the next, maybe the resilience factor in these businesses over the next 6 to 12 months.
Correct.
And then, weigh and measure all these factors in, and then take a call on the businesses.
Totally.
Another question on COVID is, did you need to restructure operations in a few portfolio companies, or how's the industry thinking about, for example, microfinance is one example where, they've had to restructure a lot of loans, but well, you don't probably give money to microfinance, but there would be certain other industries where you're serving customers whose personal balance sheets are very stretched, and their personal P&Ls are stretched because the days of employment are somewhat limited. How do you view such assets if you're already invested, or if a new proposal comes in for venture funding? How do you approach them?
Sure. So as I mentioned, like for the one space that was really impacted was like mobility. So we had a couple of mobility transactions which had to go some restructuring, and you have to provide them further, leeway to ensure the business comes back to some kind of normalcy. But if you were again, as I said, if you had exposure to travel, retail, space, then again you need to provide that kind of comfort. So we had exposure to some fintech companies who are in this some kind of lending to customers who would be possibly new to credit, or they will be customers who possibly will be having maybe low civils and maybe having losing some kind of job. So what happens in this kind of companies also was that they didn't come to us for some kind of restructuring or moratorium because they're not leveraged to that level. And a lot of these loans were like short-term loans, so you are able to recover almost like 70% of your loan book within the period of 4 to 5 months. So you're sitting on a lot of liquidity and you're not disbursing further. So you're able to take care of your liabilities. So actually, even though business goes through a certain kind of churn, even though your NPS may become 8-10%, that does not mean that you cannot service your liabilities or you cannot continue running your business. You have to just be there, out there, focus on your collections. And then you have to re-look at your entire underwriting strategy, that this is the kind of people I don't want to lend to, and these are the kind of people I want to lend to, and then you restart the business. So everybody had to change the business model. So we had these companies who are in the mobility space in the way that they're providing used two-wheelers and used cars, as sort of they are branded them and selling it. Right? It's like you could say a B2C business as such. They had their centers. So they had to obviously shut down their centers, and they started operating from dark stores. And they are saying, okay, Pushkar, you stay in XYZ area. I'll send the car to your place. You can just have the car, look at the car which you've selected online, and we can you can do the test drive there, and you don't need to come to our place. So everybody has to reimagine their businesses. So that is the only way you can work. You cannot say that I will just sit back and hope for COVID to get over and then figure out. So the reason startups do well is because they are nimble and can take decisions quickly. Like we had companies, 2-3 companies opportunistically got into the COVID products, like selling PPE kits and all to ensure that they're making some kind of profitability, even though their main product is not selling. So you're out there selling it to SMEs or enterprise customers who are sort of looking at, or you start selling to hospitals or to government. So depending on your businesses, people are sort of try to pivot for that period of time and ensure that some businesses are happening, and not letting COVID just hit you and just sit back and you just scrib, okay, I could not have done anything, COVID has happened. So that's not the attitude at which startups generally work with.
There's a question of on portfolio management, which I'd like to maybe add a couple of dimensions to as well. So the question is, do you work closely with the management teams after investment, given your tenure of investment? Let me add one more dimension to it. How is your asset management similar or different from classic VC funds, post investment?
So VC funds are definitely much closely working with the company, right? So they are on the board of the company, and they have to take more strategic decisions of the company. So we are more passive investors from the perspective of from that idea. But for us, it's as I said, regularly we will also be evaluating the MIS of a company on a monthly basis, like any other equity investor would be doing. And because if you study any company, you end up having 10 other questions. So you're automatically studying with the company closely. So what happens is you divide your portfolio in generally in 2 to 3 parts, and you have to focus on your high risk companies, then focusing on your low risk companies, or your high performers, and you have to put more of your energy in the low performers, so that you ensure that there is not a problem, right? What happens possibly for a VC, he might do the other way around, because he wants to ensure his high performers become better performers, because our returns are fixed. You don't have to put that extra effort on that aspect relatively to the aspect that the low performance don't really become an NPA. So there's a little bit of difference in the way these two sort of people will work. And finally, it is, if you see something going wrong, you just pick up the phone and tell the company, right, why are you doing this, right? What is the idea behind it? You need to know what is the story behind it, what's the strategy behind it, and if there is a reason what is happening. And generally they'll get a good strategic or a logical answers. And sometimes, obviously, because you're not an equity investor, they may disregard your advice, but maybe 3 months down the line, they may end up doing the same thing, right? Because
they may disregard the advice irrespective, but anyway.
correct. Yeah. That is true. But yeah, so but you have to keep pushing, right? That's your job. So
sure.
And then you
keep bringing new ideas on the table. Let the quality of the ideas speak for itself. and
Correct.
the
Correct.
founders, right?
So other value addition things we also keep doing, right? We also keep introducing them to a lot of equity investors. We kept introducing them to family offices who want to take equity investments. We kept introducing them to potential customers. There are a lot of situations where one portfolio company could be a customer to another portfolio company. Like for example, some companies may want some fintech solutions that will be in another portfolio company. So a lot of leverage and synergy, something that even as equity guys do, even sort of we also try to bring on the picture. There are bankers who may help you in fundraising. So there are a lot of this kind of situation, and even lending in that matter, that I may also bring further borrowers a potential other lender that you could work with, or a bank also for that matter, if there is some kind of strategic interest in that. So one has to add value, that you cannot just sit back. But just to add one more point, though we are passive compared to equity guys, we are much more active compared to traditional debt guys. So
Sure.
they are somewhere again in the middle there, so that we are at any point of time can tell you exactly what is happening in the portfolio.
Another quick question is on how do you source deals?
When you start a business, it's very difficult, right? Because if you do not have any pedigree of a VC network, very difficult to obviously make a mark, because there are already existing players in the market. So we went through that entire business turn. You have to build that relationships with various VCs and your portfolio companies, and provide a solution that they're really looking for. So once you do that, I think the deal flow comes by itself, almost, I would say, right? Because there are, as I said, only a handful of players in the market. Everybody knows who are those handful of players, and they will obviously shop around and see whoever can give the best of terms. So if you're on a top of the mind recall, in most cases, either the potential portfolio company or the VC will sort of reach out to you, because if you're as a buy side, five companies generally end up coming to you, then you have to go towards the company. But whatever said and done, you have to keep tracking of interesting companies. Right? You keep getting introduced to interesting companies. They may not take money that time. They may take money 2 years from now. So you have to maintain relationships with many companies. And if you have good relations with the existing portfolio companies, they will recommend their friends, right? Because there's a strong IIT IIM circle who are sort of working with each other. A lot of times, my companies who are customers of some other company, they may need that, they sort of refer to you. There's a huge amount of word of mouth that sort of works in this sort of space. And I can just say that we are like a 40-member team, and not one person right now is focused on business development except myself. So you can imagine the kind of focus is on execution and not really business growth. So that's the kind of inbound amount of transaction that we generally see. And after a point of time, investment bankers are also getting very active to sort of help raise debt for their clients. So it's quite a view of opportunities out there as such.
Right. One stream of questions is on founder profile. How important is that for your business? And do you take personal guarantees from the founders?
So personal guarantees is extremely rare. It's not common in the business. If it's the founder is little bit more of traditional types, or he has taken money from bank in the past, because as I mentioned, sometimes they may have given their home as collateral and taken money from a bank. Then they are used to giving personal guarantees, so you may try to take it, but most of the cases you don't get personal guarantees. Sometimes you may end up getting a share pledge as additional security, which I feel is of limited value, because if a company goes down, then that share value is also limited. And in the third case, the question was, I thought I forgot. You said about what's the one more part of the question?
About how important is
Founders
founder
mentality.
profile?
Founders, yeah. Founders
Do you do
profile.
background checks on them? Do you, from a positive contribution, do you weigh and measure the previous entrepreneurs? How important is that in your deal selection criteria?
It is important, right? Because you're backing the management finally, whether it's a promoter or whether it's a professional. Finally, it's very important that the company is able to go to the next round of funding, and whether he inspires confidence in the business model that he is working on, and whether he's able to really take the business to the next level. That is very important. So his background is very important. What kind of comfort he has with other shareholders is critical, and whether he's able to go to the next level, the business, you have to take a call on that. So because you're finally backing the horse, right? So the cart will follow the horse. So we cannot say the cart is great, but the horse is not.
and so you cannot work without that. And in a startup, the founder plays extreme amount of role. So he have to be getting feedback about him from these VCs and possibly his possible companies that he's worked with in the past. So you do try to do a informal background check on the same.
Another question on exits. When you think about exits, is it usually the VCP funds who are funding the next round, or are you also seeing other venture debt funds come in nowadays? Do you see some of the banks come in with perhaps different kind of debt products? Can you share some insights there?
Yeah, so exits, as I said, as a structure perspective, it is automatic, right? Because you are structured the loan in EMI format or API format, so you're getting money back regularly. So the source of funds can be from your existing runway that you have. And if you become EBITDA positive, that is also the case in a lot of our portfolio companies, and the cash flow of the business can also service it. And you're right. So next round of funding is the easiest way to get funding out. We have seen when sometimes the company does really well, some traditional NBFC sort of comes into the picture also, and they can sort of take a call because there might be some kind of collateral that they like in the business. So if you're a logistic company, you may have some warehouses that you have built in that they like to sort of take a charge on. So they could be an NBFC, venture debt, all the likes that you just mentioned. All of them have been coming in and providing a kind of an exit to people like us.
Great. We've got the last couple of minutes left. So I'll probably take up one question. Maybe we can squeeze in one more. Can you talk to us a little bit about competition from VCP funds? They're beginning to offer different types of debt products as well. Some of them are. How do you see that?
So I have not seen VCP guys offer debt products as competition, but I have seen equity becoming my competition, right? Because if the guy is raising equity and debt at the same time, then obviously he'll take equity then debt at point of time, right? Because it's a permanent capital, they don't have to return it. So a lot of times our transactions don't happen or get significantly delayed is because the equity happens, right? We have one case in our sale where he signed a term sheet, but he's not taken the money yet. It's been almost 12 months now because he's taken 2 rounds of equity by now. So it is a priority of the founder will generally be equity, or maybe my terms are not great. So that is another thing that I need to learn. But finally, it is more equity than debt as competition.
Got it. Let me squeeze in the last question. We've got a minute left. The Black Soil team has a NBFC structure, right? Unlike some of the other setups. So if you could talk a little bit about what are the advantages versus traditional VCFs in that structure?
I think the biggest advantage is that we can leverage and improve our equity returns. So which is you cannot do in an AIF structure. So that I think is I would see as the only advantage as such. Otherwise, there is definitely not other thing. And the thing is that from a fund manager perspective, it's permanent capital that I've raised. So I don't really need to return it, right? So otherwise you are always on the treadmill of raising fund 1, fund 2, fund 3. So that is not really the requirement if you have an NBFC which is substantially capitalized. But obviously, money is raw material, so you have to raise that also at one point of time. It's not sufficient forever.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thanks to the audience for asking all these questions. The questions keep coming. I have not been able to do justice to all the questions. I've tried to ask as many as I could, punch them up. But please feel free to post some more questions, and Ankur will be happy to answer them at a later point in time. Thank you so much. Over to you, Achal.